In Los Angeles, there are stories that don't just fade into history. They echo, they linger, they sit in the dust of old buildings and in the memories of people who lived through them. And one of the darkest began not in Hollywood or downtown, but in a quiet beachfront district of Santa Monica in 1958, when a recovering alcoholic named Charles Dederick rented a storefront in Ocean Park and unknowingly planted the seed of what would become one of California's most infamous cults. Before it became a cautionary tale, before the weapons and the forced marriages and the rattlesnake attacks, Synanon started as a radical experiment in addiction recovery, a place where people who had been kicked out of hospitals and rehabs finally found a door that didn't slam shut in their faces. Charles Chuck Dederick wasn't a guru at the beginning. He was a struggling alcoholic who found sobriety through Alcoholics Anonymous, but grew frustrated with its structure and pacing. He believed addicts needed something more confrontational, more intense, something that stripped away the polite language and forced people to face the parts of themselves they avoided. So he opened that tiny storefront and invited heroin addicts, people who had nowhere else to go, to sit in a circle and tell the truth as brutally as they could manage. The method became known as the game, a kind of group therapy where members verbally attacked each other, shouting out insecurities, resentments, secrets, and flaws, with the idea that total honesty could break addiction by breaking denial. And in those early years, when the room still smelled like cigarette smoke and ocean air, something real happened. People stayed clean longer than anyone expected, and they did it together. Word spread fast across Los Angeles. Judges began sentencing addicts to Synanon instead of jail. Doctors and social workers visited and left impressed. The Los Angeles Times covered the program like a miracle rising out of a forgotten corner of the beach. By the early 1960s, Synanon had outgrown its storefront and expanded into larger properties in Santa Monica, becoming one of the first residential rehab communities in the country. Addicts moved in permanently, sharing chores, food, and responsibilities, feeling for the first time like they belong somewhere. But success has a way of changing people, especially people who suddenly find themselves at the center of attention. And the more praise Dederick received, the more he began to believe he wasn't just running a rehab. He was building a new society. As Synanon grew, it spread beyond Los Angeles, establishing properties in Marin County, the desert, and even other states. Middle-class families, teachers, lawyers, and idealists joined, attracted by the sense of purpose and community Synanon offered. But inside, the culture was shifting. Dederick declared that Synanon wasn't a rehab anymore. It was a lifetime rehabilitation movement, and that shift meant people no longer graduated out. Once you joined, the expectation became clear. You stayed. Members who left were not celebrated for completing recovery. They were criticized as quitters, splitties, or enemies of the new way of life. The game, once pitched as therapy, became a tool for control. Members sat for hours under harsh lights, taking verbal attacks from others while leaders watched for signs of defiance. What started as confrontation became humiliation, and what began as honesty became a mechanism to break people down until they were emotionally dependent on the group. Over time, Synanon increasingly resembled a closed world with its own rules, its own justice, and a leader whose word was unquestioned. By the 1970s, Synanon had transformed into something far removed from rehab. Dederick restructured marriages by decree, ordering couples who'd been together for years to split up and take new partners chosen by leadership. Men were pressured into vasectomies, and reports later surfaced of some women being pushed toward abortions. Children were separated from parents and raised communally in schools run by Synanon itself, sometimes with strict discipline that bordered on abuse. Everything inside Synanon was designed to keep the organization at the center of members' emotional, social, and even biological lives. Synanon also became wealthy, shockingly wealthy for an organization that started in a rented storefront. It built businesses, acquired land, established schools, operated a radio station, and set up extensive corporate fronts. Donations poured in from celebrities and California elites who believed Synanon had discovered something powerful. But power has a way of corrupting even the best intentions, and inside Synanon, that corruption was growing like mold under a wall nobody inspected. Critics began investigating. Journalists started writing stories questioning Synanon's finances, its treatment of children, and its increasingly aggressive rules. Parents who wanted their kids back tried to get lawyers involved, and former members who escaped began telling stories about beatings, manipulation, and surveillance. By this point, Dederick was showing the impact of alcohol again, even as he publicly preached sobriety, and his decisions became more erratic, more paranoid, and more violent. He established a group called the Imperial Marines, essentially an internal militia trained to intimidate defectors and critics. Members stockpiled weapons and practiced drills on remote ranch properties. Synanon no longer resembled a therapeutic community. It resembled a paramilitary cult preparing for conflict. The breaking point came in 1978, when attorney Paul Morantz won a civil case against Synanon for abducting and assaulting a woman who had tried to leave the group. Morantz knew the risks of challenging an organization with a history of retaliation, but he didn't expect what came next. One night he returned to his home in Pacific Palisades and reached into his mailbox to collect his mail. Inside, coiled in the dark, was a de-rattled baby rattlesnake, placed there deliberately so he wouldn't hear its warning. The snake struck him, injecting venom that sent him collapsing onto the floor. Neighbors found him, rushed him to the hospital, and doctors fought to reverse the poisoning. Morantz survived, but the attack set off alarms across California. A statewide investigation began, uncovering wiretapped conversations, internal memos, and audio recordings where Synanon leaders discussed violent plans against journalists, lawyers, and defectors. Dederick was arrested in December 1978 and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Because his health was deteriorating, years of heavy drinking had taken a toll, he eventually received probation instead of prison time. But that didn't save Synanon. The IRS revoked its tax-exempt status in 1991 after years of legal pressure, court judgments, and financial scrutiny. The organization dissolved soon after, its property sold off, its members scattering across the state, some trying to rebuild normal lives after years inside a world that had reshaped their identities. Today, pieces of Synanon's past still dot California. Some of the buildings still stand, empty, graffitied, slowly collapsing into the desert or coastal fog. Survivors still describe the early years with a strange mix of gratitude and trauma, remembering the sense of community that saved their lives before everything twisted into something impossible to recognize. Historians study Synanon because it represents something rare, a real-time transformation of a social experiment into a cult, documented in newspapers, court filings, and thousands of hours of recorded games that show exactly how easily power can warp intention. And that's the truth about Synanon. It started as a desperate attempt to save people when Los Angeles had no real rehab system, and for a moment it worked. But power, isolation, and obedience built a new kind of beast, one born on the Santa Monica coast, that grew into a movement, then a religion, then a militia, until violence became the final language it spoke. It's a reminder that in Los Angeles, the line between salvation and control can disappear faster than anyone realizes, and that sometimes the most dangerous stories begin with the best intentions.